Hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi Salem Pearce. I want to just start by saying I am a rabbi in this congregation, not the rabbi. He is in Israel today and asked me to give the Devar Torah in his absence. So a few weeks ago, I finished a years-long Havruta on Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Bamidbar, with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Shachar Holt. And this Havruta was occasioned by a trip that Shachar and I and several other rabbis took to the Arizona border in the summer of 2018. In response to a call from the nonprofit organization No More Deaths, we and many other clergy members traveled to a tiny town called Ajo, where migrants crossing the US-Mexico border often meet their deaths in a hostile landscape. We hiked into the desert to drop as much water as we could carry and also hide that water from Border Patrol, who routinely destroy this life-saving humanitarian aid upon encounter. Another friend and colleague, Rabbi Arilev Fornari, looking out across the deadly terrain, remarked, "I can see why our people relied on God as they moved through a place like this." So this trip won't be the subject of the Devar Torah today, although I'm happy to share more another time. But I open with it to establish the stakes of what I do want to talk about today. The contemporary scholar Aviva Zornberg characterizes Sefer Bamidbar as the narrative of a great failure, what should have been for the Israelites a brief journey from Mount Sinai to the Holy Land becomes a 40-year death march. But, she insists, it is also the setting for extraordinary spiritual experience with human partners in an unprecedented conversation with deity. This is the power of the Midbar, the desert. It speaks, medaber, in Hebrew. We have but to listen. I want to suggest today that we listen to what Sefer Bamidbar has to say about gender. Yes, this might seem on its face quite a stretch. After all, 2 weeks ago, in the book's opening parsha, God instructs Moshe to conduct a census of all of the men of military age. That week, the bat mitzvah, Sivius Schwartz, reminded me out in that very lobby, with totally appropriate disdain, there are literally no women in my parsha. And we just spent the Torah reading today, the longest of all the parshiot, mostly reciting the gifts of the male princes of each tribe on the occasion of the dedication of the altar. Not a woman to be named. And the only woman that we do encounter this week is the very pointedly unnamed one, known only by her purported sin in the ritual of the sota, humiliation inflicted because her loyalty to her husband is in doubt. Zornberg suggests, however, that it is important to note both this first narrative of Bamidbar, the sota, and the other legal narrative that ends the book, about the daughters of Tzelofchad, who claim their right to inherit their father's land, and who are also very pointedly named, all 5 of them. One might say, Zornberg writes, that the book is framed by the feminine, that women provide the armature for this book of in the wilderness. I cannot begin to do justice to her argument at this moment, but I highly recommend her book, Bewilderments, and especially this chapter called Madness and Civilization, in which she explores the problems of doubt, ambiguity, uncertainty, error, and the desire for beauty. I offer today just a taste of the work Zornberg does, starting with a remarkable midrash that Rashi cites. As I just mentioned, Sefer Bamidbar is, in Zornberg's trenchant summary, the story of a 40-year death march. Indeed, because of the incident of the spies a few parshiot hence, there is another census of the people, a second one after the one we read about 2 weeks ago. We're told in Numbers 24, 64 through 65. Among these, there was not one of those enrolled by Moshe and Aaron the priest when they recorded the Israelites in the wilderness of Sinai. For Adonai had said of them, they shall die in the wilderness. Not one of them survived except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Yehoshua, son of Nun. Rashi says of this verse, however, the decree against the spies did not apply to women because they loved the land. The men said, let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Numbers 14:4. While the women said, give us possession among our father's brothers. Numbers 27:4. This is why, Rashi concludes, the episode of the daughters of Zelophehad is placed right after the second census. Zornberg explains, Rashi reads the word ish, no man survived, as applying only to men as opposed to women. In this gendered reading, ish becomes the basis for a large historical claim. Women in the desert were distinguished by their love of the land and were therefore not punished. They survived the 40-year desert period. Women are traced as a hidden population possessed of a separate life of desire and a separate destiny. Invisible in the text, they represent a continuous presence within the narrated history of rupture. So I'm going to assume at this point that I've convinced you that Sefer Bamidbar, especially beginning in this parsha with the narrative of the Sota, has what to say about gender. And I look forward to more conversations this month, which is Pride Month. I'm so proud to have entered this building today with a big, beautiful pride flag flying over it. And we have some great programming here at Bethel, including in 2 weeks, an extraordinary guest scholar in residence, Noam Sienna. But as I began this Devar Torah with a story about the life and death stakes of the desert, I'm going to end with the life and death stakes of life for queer people in this moment in our country. As part of my Omer practice this year, I joined a group of people listening to episodes of the Translash podcast each of the 7 weeks. I was invited into this learning by my dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Becky Silverstein, who is also trans. The podcast is hosted by Amara Jones, whom the organization Jews for Racial and Economic Justice is honoring at its gala this fall in New York. In its about statement, the podcast website simply says, Translash tells trans stories to save trans lives. I cannot emphasize how important this podcast reporting is, as it makes clear that far from being a random coincidence, the recent deluge of anti-LGBTQ legislation across the country is a coordinated effort by the Christian right, with enormous money and power and institutions behind it. As Jews, it is our responsibility to understand and to fight against such an affront to our values and to separation of church and state. We've made incredible strides for civil rights for queer people in the last couple of decades. It's been stunning to see the sea change that has occurred in my short lifetime. But make no mistake, trans folks, and especially trans kids, the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable, are under attack by people and organizations motivated ultimately by the most pernicious Christian nationalism. You might have heard of these bills, including some being considered in our own state legislature, and you might have been moved by some of the purported justifications for them: protection of women, safety of kids, etc. Please do not be deceived. Listen to the Translash podcast. Talk to some of the trans people we are privileged to count as members of our community about their experiences. Learn queer Torah with Esther and Spara. Mazel tov for finishing your kollel. Again, above all, please do not be silent. I will end here by sharing some of my favorite words of Torah about God's love, taught to me by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Sarah Mulhern. It is said in Pirkei Avot, Chaviv Adam shenivra Salem, Hi ba yetera noda'at lo shenivra Salem. Beloved are humans, for they were created in the image of God. Especially beloved are they for it was made known to them that they were created in the image of God. So especially to all of the queer and trans folks attending or listening right now, this is what I want you to know from this rabbi and this synagogue. You are deserving of love simply because you exist. And this is true of all human beings. Shabbat shalom. May we go from strength to strength. Thank you.